Look out! Look out! Look out! Take care. You are being watched. We repeat, take care, for you are now alone with a killer. We warn you, don't let him see the fear in your eyes. For this is what he seeks, and this is why he kills.
Where are you? Where are you?
Look out for Carl Byrne as the Peeping Tom. Fear him, but pity him also.
It's so good.
Watch out for Moira Shearer as the lovely stand-in who innocently dances into danger.
Imagine someone coming towards you who wants to kill you, regardless of consequences.
A madman?
Yes.
Wait!
Anna Massey is the girl who falls victim to the charms of a lonely stranger upstairs.
Switch it off, Mark! Mark, switch it off!
Maxine Audley as the blind woman who senses the danger that threatens her and her daughter, but is helpless.
Don't be frightened.
Not frightened. What? So put that camera away!
There is no future for anyone who tries to befriend him. He invades the privacy of innocent people till the piercing eyes of his camera meet the terrified eyes of his victims. And with a compulsion akin to madness, he shoots the final, fearful scene.
Horror Hounds, welcome to episode 7 of the Black Sunday Tapes Classic Horror. This week we're looking at a classic and controversial British horror film, one that I haven't seen in many, many years, and one that I believe Michael has never seen, but obviously has now. So Michael,
several times within 48 hours.
Times. Let these fine people know what we're talking about this week.
1960s Peeping Tom, and I was taken by it for so incredibly many reasons. We're gonna get into them, but it's tone. I didn't think I'm like 1960. Really, this seems a little overtly sexual for 1960, and then you come to find out, yeah, they didn't like it because it was a little overtly sexual for 1960. As opposed to just being about the perversity of a man and. Yeah. That's about all I'm going to say before we get into the film proper. But yeah, I don't know. You go. You take over, man.
Yeah. So for those of you that may have heard of this in the background, for those of you that have seen it, and for those of you that have never seen it, Peeping Tom is a British film from the 1960s, directed by a very, very well-known director up until this point called Michael Powell. We will get into it a little bit later, but this film, like I touched on, is really controversial and kind of ended Michael Powell's career.
A little more than kind of, from what I was seeing, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something we're going to get into. So just a very brief synopsis. The film follows a young man who murders women, and he uses a movie camera to commit his crimes. And the film is following said man. It's all but essentially from his point of view and the point of view of his camera. The camera plays a major role within the way the film unfolds, the way the whole thing is shot. It's very, very POV.
The camera is literally a character. It's not just one of those things where something's like, oh, the camera is another character.
Right,
the camera
exactly.
is literally a character in this film.
Exactly. And that was part of the controversy, was what Michael Powell was trying to say with this film. It was his real deep dive into what it means to capture people on camera, what filmmaking is, what photography is, and what
What our
if we
role in it is in
exactly what our
is.
role exactly what our role as the observer is, and how far we can take that, how far our obsession can go, and that's really where this film unfolds, and it's incredible. Like I said, I saw it a good few years ago. It did stick with me back then, but for whatever reason, I hadn't gone back until obviously we were doing this podcast. It was one that I suggested to Michael quite early out of the gate that we do, and then I brought it up again, and yeah, I mean you were kind of mesmerized by this, right?
Oh man, entirely. Just its quietness, while at the same well, it doesn't open quietly at all, but it then gets kind of into this observation of life, but also very it's intensely 60s. Made in 1959, came out in 1960, I do believe.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah,
And its colors pop, its fashion, its some of its performances are really a little, much.
of course.
But I also think a lot of the stuff that's gonna make a lot of feathers ruffle, sort of societally, a lot of the toxic masculinity of it all, it was done in parody. It wasn't done in earnest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I
So,
think what was really interesting for me with this film was, and again, putting yourself in the mindset of 1960 and how this film unfolds, the lead character, his obsession, the way the lead character is portrayed. There
and how
is
good is
no.
that dude?
Oh, he's amazing.
Like,
He's absolutely incredible.
I just like his
Absolutely
face is
incredible.
mesmerizing. I think that was a literal note I took at one point.
Yeah, you really are captivated. Completely captivated. I feel like the whole cast do a
Oh yeah,
really good job with that. Yeah, some of the acting is a little bit
that Wicker Man style
over the
dance.
top. Yes, yes. But it works, man. It
Oh
really
yeah.
works. And
Oh
for
yeah, I know.
for a 1960s film, this really works. So touching on a little bit the history of why this is really controversial. So Michael Powell is responsible for such breathtaking cinematic classics as The Red Shoes, which is not horror, but if you like classic cinema and you've never seen The Red Shoes, go and watch The Red Shoes. It's stunning. It's one of the most beautiful films ever made. And he was known as a real auteur. He was someone that made very serious films, and this really shocked people. They thought he completely failed with this film, and he really downgraded himself and was playing basically with porn. Is the way it was kind of worded at the time. Is this was no better than porn,
It's
which is
also kind of
amazing.
credited as, I think, the first, in quotes, the mainstream British film to show any kind of actual female nudity.
Yes, it was, and that
Been
there's
trivia
some.
about. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. There's a little bit of trivia about that we're probably getting to by the end of
Oh,
the show.
the color thing.
No, the
Oh,
around the director actually, and why
okay.
this was where the controversy come from. And it wasn't just around the film; it was also around why they believe he made this film. And
Okay.
yeah, it's very dark, very dark. So we'll
Oh,
definitely get into that.
my thing was about their color palette. Is actually like you're mentioning porn, and
Yes,
apparently I read a bit of trivia that it was shot in a color palette that primarily at that point had only been seen in pornography.
yes. It
Yeah.
was. It was definitely. It was essentially. Is this? Most people would consider this a cinematic masterpiece. Now, Martin Scorsese, for one, considers this one of the greatest films ever made.
It kind of only got rediscovered because of his love
Oh,
and
because of
acquisition
his,
of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, without that, it was basically banned and completely taken out of any
Oh yeah.
circulation up until Scorsese brought it back in the late 70s, I believe, was the first time he started screening it, and then got a real cult
Yeah.
following.
I read an article from 1979, and it was mentioning that it was about to happen. So I want to say it was like late 79, early
Right?
80.
Yeah. And that's incredible as well because if when you talk directors, and obviously we've had the recent controversy with Scorsese with what he said about Marvel films and blockbuster
Oh,
films.
we don't have to get into that, do we?
No, we're not getting into that. Yeah, I know. No, we're not. I don't think he was saying anything too bad. We consider Scorsese to be the real gatekeeper of classic and, in his words, real cinema. So for
Yeah.
him to consider this 1960s horror film that was once considered porn. You know, the argument is this a cinematic masterpiece or is this just exploitation? You know, and for
It's the
Scorsese to
Salo
say,
argument. Yeah.
yeah, for Scorsese to say, no, this is like we're holding this up as, you know, the highest level of cinema. That's insane, and that just speaks to the film. For me, it holds its own. It still works, and it's incredibly influential. So, what stood out for you, man? I'm really interested to get your thoughts, considering it was the first time you watched it, but also you jumped in like 3 times in a row.
The filmmaking, the performances, the color palette. There's kind of no part of it that I didn't find fascinating. Even this part. Okay, so there's this discordant piano score that I really kind of love. It's really weird and off-putting, but it's that on purpose. And like I found it really interesting. Its pace that I adored was which is it's not snail-like by any stretch of the imagination, but it is methodical.
In terms of coming in it with today's gaze and the way it is really, really built up. If you don't have a certain love affair with classic cinema, it is quite slow. It is quite
No,
tedious in
I'm not mad
areas.
at that. It is, but I was about it. I was just about it because the filmmaking of it. Like there's a lot of camera movements that I love a good camera movement.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
and there was a lot of slow push-ins, and there was one 15-second like interval that I just watched kind of on a loop. Give it a full Roger Ebert triple view, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, Roger Ebert's been quoted as saying any movie Roger Ebert reviewed, he would watch 3 times. And the first time he watched it, he would just let it happen. The second time he watched it, he was looking at the story, and the third time he was looking at filmmaking, and that's how he would determine his review, like how he would write his review. It wasn't like that was how I absolutely needed to do it, but I was like I liked it so much. I was so taken by it, and I was like, yeah, this is I'm okay spending this amount of time. Let's do this again right now. And the only reason I didn't kind of watch it like twice in a row, literally, is because I had to go to work, and then I got home, and I was like, I'm just gonna play some video games, go to bed, and then I woke up and I was like, all right, let's watch it again. Let's do that again. Yeah, let's do that. And I took almost equally as many notes the second time through, and I took a lot.
You've gone down this classic horror rabbit hole with me and this classic cinema. How does this stack up for you? How do you see? And I'll tell you another interesting question and a kind of debate that I kind of threw out on Twitter this week was I put a tweet out just asking what people's favorite classic horror film was, right? And what
I
was really
actually didn't
interesting,
interact with this because I figured we would talk about it and you'd let me know what
right,
happened.
right. So what I found very interesting was that, and by the way, there's no right or wrong answer to this, right? And actually, I want to do a full episode on this later on. But
Okay.
so if you're interested in that, please let us know. But I just want to touch on it here. What was really interesting about it was, and again, there's no right or wrong answer, was some people had their favorite classic horror films from like the 80s, but I personally don't consider 80s classic horror. But then this question did appear. So when did classic horror end and when did it become modern horror? Now, for me, it was the like early to mid 70s when we started getting horror films that dealt in realism. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I Spit on Your Grave, Last House on the
Mhm,
Left. When we started getting these films that all of a sudden the tone, the atmosphere, the feel, the subject matter, it was all different. It was completely taken away from a Hollywood system. And yeah, before that, like in the 60s, you got drippings of this, right? You got like with Peeping Tom, with Psycho,
mhm,
with
mhm. Which
Night of the Living
released
Dead.
like 5.5 weeks away from each other.
Right, exactly. Yeah, with with all these films, but I feel like also there was some classic horror still within these films. There was still classic Hollywood within these films, where then you come to the 70s, and I feel like it was just this whole rebel attitude of fuck classic Hollywood. Like we're really moving forward now. So now it's like all real locations. It's guerrilla filmmaking. really rough, really raw. We don't give a shit
Yeah.
if we're getting in a
Yeah.
cinema anymore. You know, we're going out to midnight screenings. We're taking our films on the road. It was a real punk rock mentality that
Gotcha.
affected cinema. You know, so for me, that's where, you know, me and you have touched on it. A lot of the films we've done are around the 1960s period, and for me, that's
Jesus.
like 1960s is actually the end of classic horror for me.
Okay.
It goes all the way back to kind of the silent era, all the way up to 1960s. That's classic horror for me, and then beyond that is modern horror. But
Yeah.
where's that definition for you?
What's so strange to me is I was literally thinking about this, just kind of, you know, shower thoughts type
Yeah,
situation, a couple of days before you sent up that tweet, and then we sent up that tweet. I was like, well, now I feel compelled not to really, yeah, because we should talk about it. And I really don't know how I feel about it because classic is as fluid as the term art is to me. You know what I mean?
yeah, of course.
Um,
Well, like I said,
but
there's no right or wrong answer.
exactly,
I'm
exactly.
genuinely just interested in, like, for like again, my definition of classic versus modern was a tonal shift. It was a
Okay.
shift in mentality. It was a shift in the way we make films, the stories we try and tell. However, for some people, and again, rightfully so, that's just a period of time, right? For
Right.
instance, if we look at music, one of my favorite bands of all time, but for me, they're just a hard rock band or a hair metal band, Motley Crue. Yet
Okay.
Motley Crue are now considered classic rock, and that's even a bowling for soup gag in one of their songs
Yeah. Yeah.
when they're like, "When did Motley Crue become classic rock?"
Classic rock.
But
Yeah.
it's because it's to some people, 30 years ago, that's a whole lifetime. So
Yeah.
that is classic, right? But for me, it's more about the tonal shift. Like for me, music completely changed in the 60s. It
Yeah.
was between rock and roll, and rock was the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The
Okay.
Beatles were the last of rock and roll, and the Stones were the first of modern rock. And it's that, but again, some people define it more as age, where my definition is based on sound and attitude, and then with film, look, feel, atmosphere, storytelling.
Debate I've always had internally, like when I have my own video store, where am I
Yeah,
gonna put and how am I gonna put? How's it gonna go down?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
So to round off the classic horror versus modern horror discussion, and like I say, we'll definitely jump into it a little bit more. If you want that, let us know, guys. But for me, Peeping Tom, Psycho, Night of the Living Dead, these are the branches out of classic horror that would birth modern horror in the early to mid 70s. So on that note, I think we're both in agreement, haven't we, Michael, that we both see Peeping Tom as classic horror. I know you've
100%.
got a lot of notes to
Oh,
dive
so
into.
many.
Yeah, I'm
So many.
I'm really, really interested in those notes. So yeah, take us there, man.
Okay. Now I'm not to know like locations of where album covers were taken, but the first shot of that alley,
Oh yeah, okay.
it looks like an album cover, and both times I saw it, the Bowie cover and it's the Ziggy Stardust cover. I don't know, just it really. I
Right,
looked.
yeah,
I
I
tried
didn't
look.
think of that. But now you've said that, I see it, yeah. I see it. I mean, it's possible. I don't know. I'd have to look into it.
I tried to look into it. It didn't pan out well for me. But like
Okay.
it looked so much like it to me that I took that note like both times.
I can
Anyway,
see that. I can see it. Now you've said it. Like I said, it didn't cross my mind, but now you've said it, yeah. I see where you're coming from.
the first time through, I was like, "What did she say?" And I run it back. Can you make it so the bruises won't show? And it was like, "Oh,
Yeah. That was
Jesus, man,
interesting.
super harsh."
Well,
Like,
again, that was part of the
half.
controversy.
Oh
Was
yeah.
the really dark nature, and also the fact that she was very, very open about like having an affair. So
Hmm.
again, that was very controversial back in 1960. Especially in England. You
That's the
you know,
thing, because I knew
women
while I
weren't
was reading
allowed
it.
to be open about that kind of stuff. And for a woman just to be very, very open about that, but also to be very open about she got caught and then got beat up. and that's almost just her way of life. She just accepts it. It's a very, very dark portrayal. Yeah, she's owning it, but she's also like very troubled. She is being beaten. She is being abused,
Mhm.
and it's a very small little hint of that, but it is there. And yeah, that created controversy, man.
It
That
was
was
so
a
I
big
one of the
hit.
reasons I was so taken by it is because that was the whole thing. I was like, it's a subtle thing. Like today, I'd be like, man, that's some kind of like.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like it's not the deep S, but that's kind of deep, like
it's rough.
surface level. Yeah, yeah. I don't know, man. Like it was really,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
rough, man.
fucking.
It's really, really
But
rough. And that is the legacy of this film, is the controversy. One of the reasons this was also hugely controversial is it is widely considered the first slasher film ever made.
I would definitely have to agree with that,
Yeah, it was
especially in a
definitely,
more classical slasher definition as well. Then then
yes.
then Psycho gets that credit a lot, but
Yeah, it
yeah,
does. I mean, this and Psycho come out basically at the same time. But
yeah.
and really interesting.
Within
I
literally like
mean,
6 weeks of each other. Yeah.
yeah, and two British directors, two very famous British directors, both very controversial films, but Hitchcock survived it. Hitchcock actually come out better from
Hmm.
Psycho
Hmm.
than when he went in, where it was the complete other way with power with this film. He it literally destroyed his career. I believe he went to Australia afterwards and
And
got a couple of
I
gigs, but
love
that was it.
Psycho, but I found this movie to be more affecting than Psycho to me personally.
Yeah, I can see that. I can definitely see that argument. I think they were like quite equal for me, like for different reasons, and
Okay.
I love them both for different reasons. But just on that slasher note, there is a little interesting bit of trivia that was dug up from this. So a lot of people would have heard of Peeping Tom either through the greatest films list, the greatest horror list, or you may have heard it from Scream 4, because there's actually a bit of dialogue in Scream 4 where they reference it as the first film that showcased the killer's point of view. That actually is incorrect. The first film to ever do it was a film called The Lodger in 1944, and then another film called The Hangover Square in 1945, which were both by the same director. And yeah, they done it first, but they are far lesser known films. But yeah, I thought that's quite a cool fact. So it is widely regarded as the first slasher film, but in
Yeah.
terms of the Scream 4 reference, where it's the first film from the killer's point of view, that is actually incorrect. It was The Lodger and Hangover Square a year later. But yeah, I just thought I'd throw that out. I thought that was quite interesting actually.
100%, man. One thing I did not expect to say about sitting through a movie from 1960 was to say that anything happened and it was gnarly, and that happened. Um, and the fact that like I was like, man, it's 1960, Jesus. And so what I'm saying is this at one point this woman who's been facing away from camera the entire time turns to camera, and she's there to take naked photographs, and she has a facial scar that's almost akin to, if you've seen Kill Bill Volume 2, the Michael Parks does to the hooker lady, cut her face. It was a similar scar to me, and it was just intense. And the look of sadness on his, because essentially as she turns around, she says, "They said you needn't photograph my face." So she's there to do pornographic things as long as they don't photograph her face. Like that's where she's gotten to, and that kind of reads on her face and the way that she says line or two that she has. And I don't know, man, because I just watching it right now. I'm like, man, that's fucked up. And then I'm like trying to contextualize it. At the time, I was like, what the, really?
Yeah.
This this happened?
Well,
And
again,
this it,
that leads
okay,
into the controversy, man. That's the whole controversy around this picture, was the portrayal of women from multiple point of views, like the portrayal of women as objects,
oh yeah,
the portrayal of some women where they're completely owning that and
yeah,
accepting
yeah.
of their position within this film,
The
or within
vision
the
behind
world
it.
of the film. Yeah, extremely controversial. But again, from what I understand, that was all by design, because the director really, really wanted to explore the real dark side of cinema, the real dark side of the camera and the lens, and what that means to us and as the observer.
Right.
And again, that wasn't really done too much up until this point, and essentially people just weren't ready for it. I think is the real note to take away from it. People just weren't ready for it. So much so that, again, I know I keep saying this, but I think it's incredible that it destroyed the man's career. Not only by today's standards is this film not as shocking for those values, but also it's quite hard to ruin someone's career these days. Like, you don't really think of someone making like a bad controversial film and then pretty much never making a film again, especially someone who also made some classics beforehand.
Oh, very much
So
so.
it's quite crazy to think that this could be such a big misstep that it completely ruined his career in the UK. And he never, I think maybe he got like one job in the UK after this, but nothing of note, and then went to Australia to try and get some work, and that was it.
So one of my notes was, I'm gonna need the score because like it's this weird discordant piano that I really enjoyed. It's not John Williams, but it's mood setting for what it's doing. It's perfect.
Well, I really liked it because I couldn't really put my finger on if it works or not.
Okay,
But by the end
I
of the
thought
film,
it did.
it did work because it
Yeah.
definitely had that effect on me. It was a strange choice, but I feel like it was unsettling, if anything. But that's the emotion you want, right? Like, you're meant to be
Well,
unsettled by this film.
okay. So because you just exactly said that, literally the next note that I got, this film is just uncomfortable.
It is uncomfortable.
So, oh
It's
yeah, no,
it's
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 supposed to
uncomfortable.
be
It's unsettling.
100%. Yeah.
And it's a very surreal performance. And again, and yeah, I keep coming back to controversy, but I really do feel like you can't talk about anything with this film. We're not being being controversial. And part of that unsettling character, that unrelenting character, is there's no saving grace, really. I mean, I know there's the story of like he's a product of his father, like he's followed in his father's footsteps.
He
But
definitely
even
becomes
then,
sympathetic, but he's never a good guy.
like, does he become sympathetic though? Like, that's the
I
interesting
Okay,
question.
well, I'm saying like that's an argument you can have, and the reason it rolled off my tongue is because like I'm not saying like I'm like, oh, poor baby, but I was like, oh, I get how he became what he is because he opens up about how he became who he is, which is one of the things that I truly that genuinely is one of the reasons I came back to it. I was like, oh my god, this movie from an era that like I've like this, based on what we've been watching thus far and based on what I have seen, I was like, I did not expect this movie any kind of way deep. And I'm like, they let us. They're not saying he's a good guy because he showed us this shit, but they're like, this is how he. This is how audience watching this thing
Yeah,
happen. And I loved that. Got
yeah, I'm there
a
with you.
degree in psychology. I loved it.
So while we're on the subject, I'm going to bring up probably the most controversial trivia, also the most fascinating trivia. Like I keep touching on, this ruined the director's career. It ruined the director's career for two reasons. One was the film in general, what the film portrayed, how the film dealt with its characters, and just the general public reaction to it. The other, more inside controversy, was the fact that, and we've just touched on it, you are at the end dealt a sympathy blow for the main character because of the home videos he shows of
Hmm.
his dad and a young version of himself. And the director played the father,
Uh
but
huh.
also his real life son played the young protagonist.
Sure
Now, that
did.
was controversial in itself. That was controversial in itself because there were questions around why the director where to make this film anyway. And the fact that he cast himself and cast his son in the role that within this world made this film completely responsible was very controversial. But here's where it gets very, very interesting. And this is where it probably really did ruin his career. He actually brought his son to set on a couple of days. And one of these days kind of blows the mind. And it's towards the end of the film. It is you touched on earlier, Michael, the first ever topless shot of a female
Okay.
within British cinema. But the story goes that this scene was never ever scripted for her to be topless. It was never ever in the screenplay for her to take her top off. Yet he changed this on the day of shooting. Not only did he change it as they were shooting the scene, but yes, he had his son right next to him observing this scene and essentially directing the scene with his son, which was a complete mirror image to the actress in this scene. It was a complete mirror image to the home video footage that is then presented later on that is responsible for the Peeping Tom, essentially, for the title character and for the overarching theme of this film. This become extremely controversial, as you can probably guess, because it asks deep questions about the director's mental state, and if he was essentially making this film to exercise his own demons, of which he was passing down to his real life son.
My artist brain says, well, of course he played the father and his kid played the kid. Save some of them ducats. You have a real ease of communication. Like, yeah, it makes sense. Dunzo, we're done. But the in quote normal brain, the go-to say, let's not play the sadistic father and use your own kid. Child Protective Services, somebody call them right now.
It doesn't sit well, I've got to be honest. And you know what? Like, I'm kind of gonna go back on myself a little bit here, but I said earlier around the film about making a film that's so controversial that it ruins your career. That wouldn't happen today. You can't make a film so controversial today that it would essentially ruin your career. I still think that's true. However, if we're talking about the personal implications of what happened on set and the personal implications of possibly why he was making this film and why he involved his son, fuck yeah, that would ruin your career, right? Like, you would probably be arrested for that shit today. Like, that's not right. Like, there's something rough about that. You
That
know,
that film would have been shut down that day. The film wouldn't get
well, especially where the idea is that if you do have any nudity on set, then you move to what's called a closed set, where you
right.
have the bare minimum amount of crew. You literally have your director, your cinematographer, your sound guy, makeup, and your actors, right? Like, you literally go to the most skeleton crew possible to protect the modesty of the actors in question. The fact that that didn't happen here, but didn't happen to the extent where there was a little kid on set, and the director's kid that had no business being there, like, he's not in that scene. He's not in that scene. He's got nothing to do with it. Man, that's fucking messed up.
That's
It
real weird.
really
That's
is
real
messed
weird.
up.
That's real weird. Well, a lot of the research that I did touched upon the fact that a lot of what made people uncomfortable about it was its overt questioning of the audience's implicitness in the activities being depicted, given that they are there to see them.
So on that note, I'm going to bring up the last bit of trivia to end on. And I'm not even sure if you know this, but I feel this is like a bit of a continuation of Peeping Tom. So like you previously touched on, while there's controversy around what the director's motives were, the wider belief, and to be honest with you, the belief I like to take is, yes, there is some very concerning aspects to the production mainly. However, I feel like this was the director holding a mirror up to society and saying what is right, what is wrong, what is acceptable, and just essentially holding a mirror up to us and asking questions of us. This isn't something he really stops with Peeping Tom. The last film he ever made, I believe actually he made one documentary after this, but the last out and out film he ever made, like I said, was in Australia, and it's called Age of Consent, and stars
Okay.
a very young Helen Mirren. And I will simply read you the synopsis. A grizzled Australian painter decides to jolt his stale creativity in a remote island on the Great Barrier Reef, where he meets an alluring young islander who becomes his enchanting model. Could the untamed girl be his long-awaited muse? Again, this film is called Age of Consent. Do with that what you will.
Oh God.
Take that into the context of Peeping Tom and the controversy around it. Yeah, dude, we could go on for days. There's so much you can debate about this, so much discussion that can be had about it.
I know
And
we've talked
so,
about revisiting.
oh yes, we've
This
talked
might
about
be what have
revisiting.
to
I think
be
this is
of
one.
them.
Yeah, this is one we're gonna have to
Yeah.
revisit. You know, and on that note, please let us know what you think of this film. If you have seen this film before, what your reactions were when you first saw it. If you've never seen it and you're watching it the first time for this podcast, please let us know. We'd love to know everyone's opinions, how you view this, how maybe you viewed it 10 years ago to the way you view it today. I think it changes every time I see it. It certainly changes every time I learn something new about the history of the film or the production of the film. And yeah, guys, this is a crazy one. It's been a good one, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you suggested it. I'm intensely happy I finally saw it. So
Yes, yes. It's definitely one you've got to see. It's definitely one you've got to dive down that rabbit hole, find out a little bit about it, because love it or hate it, it is a very influential film. And the stories around the film, in all honesty, are just as good as the production itself and just as fascinating as the production itself. So, yeah, guys and girls, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. And until next week, Horror Hounds, stay safe.
take care, everybody.
Bye.